Hey everyone, and welcome to our first virtual book club session. We're excited to kick off this series with New York Times bestselling author Madeline Miller. Madeline Miller is the author of the award-winning book The Song of Achilles and the bestseller Circe, both fantastic adaptations of Homer's Iliad and Odyssey. Today we're going to focus on the latest book, Circe. So please feel free to leave your comments in the comments section below our video, and we'll try to get to as many of them as possible during our Q&A portion. Madeline, welcome to our first live virtual book club.
Hello, and thank you so much for having me. This is the first time I've done this live, so it's really fun.
Well, we're happy that you're doing it with us. And given all the circumstances that around the world, with everyone social distancing, we think this virtual opportunity is truly unique for readers to be able to tune in and ask questions from authors. So as I said before, when you do have questions, please leave a comment. We'll be able to pull them up, and you'll be able to pick Madeline Miller's brain a little bit. But I'll get us started first. You've taken on two daunting tasks over the last years, Madeline, attempting to retell the original epics by Homer, the Iliad and the Odyssey. What is it about Homer and the classics that led you to take the leap and say, you know what, this is what I want to commit my career to?
These were stories that I loved since I was a child. They were stories I grew up reading and rereading and obsessing over. And when I finally learned to read ancient Greek in high school and I started reading them in the original, I just completely fell in love. The poetry was so beautiful, the language was so powerful that I knew heading off to college I wanted to continue to study these things and to become a classicist. But at the same time, that was going on, I also wanted to be a writer, and I was writing, but I was only writing contemporary things. It never even occurred to me to write about the ancient world, because the ancient world was sort of this pure love on my part. It honestly would have been seen to me as blasphemy. to try and write back to it. So I'm writing, I'm in college, I'm in graduate school, I'm writing over here, totally modern stuff, and I'm studying classics over here. And then at some point I had an epiphany that, oh my gosh, that master's thesis that I was planning to write about interpretations of Achilles and Patroclus as lovers through the centuries, actually, I want that to be a novel. And so all that research just went right into the Song of Achilles, and the things I wanted to say about Achilles and Patroclus, actually, I wanted to say in fiction form. I wanted to prove them, not in, an academic paper, but in a novel, in the world of a novel. So as soon as I realized that I could write about those things, and that my academic background had been preparing me really well to write about those things, it was just, there was no going back.
In the Odyssey, Circe essentially only makes a cameo appearance as part of Odysseus's broader story. So when reading the book, it was awesome to get that perspective of the ancient world from someone else's eyes, and especially a character like Circe, who there's actually not that much out there about her. How did you decide that this is the character that you really wanted to focus on?
Well, Circe had been hanging around in my mind for a long time, from basically the first time that I read the Odyssey in translation. So I was 13 the first time I read it, and I knew from reading about Greek myths that there was this witch who turned men into pigs. And I thought, that sounds really cool, and I definitely want to know more about her. But when I got to the Circe episode in the Odyssey, I was incredibly frustrated. I thought, what? This is it? He tames her on her knees? He pulls a sword on her? What's happening here? And so I that feeling of frustration, I think, really lodged in me, and I wanted more of Circe. And so in a way, I feel like Song of Achilles I was kind of trying to tell a secret story that I feel like is, right there, kind of running alongside an interpretation that's always been there, running alongside the Iliad. But with Circe, I really wanted to take this character and kind of expand her wildly out of the Odyssey. That the Odyssey is just one portion. So actually, I was very deliberate about this. So she, as you say, is just a cameo. She shows up in about 2+ books of the Odyssey. So Odysseus is only in 2+ chapters of the novel, because I wanted the novel to really be focused on her whole life.
Yeah, I noticed that. And I think it was awesome when you place her in, I think, the entire spectrum of Greek mythology, starting with the clash between the Titans and the Olympian gods, and that interesting political dynamic that you throw into the book. And then, her encounters with Daedalus and the Minotaur, and with Jason and the Argonauts, and then leading up to Odysseus. What was the big challenge to make these connections, given what's available in original text? And how much was it you extrapolating? How much was it something that you had found and read and decided, hey, this hasn't really gotten a lot of attention, let me bring it into the book?
So it was some of both. I really loved I love the fact that she was a Titan, that she was a daughter of Helios, which sort of brings her into contact with a much stranger side of kind of Greek myth than the classical Olympian gods. I love that she had all these, old nature deities who were her family. And that also there's this, as you say, there's this sort of class system among the gods. And so she's born into this very interesting family where her family is second best compared to the Olympian gods, but her father is also the god of the sun. So he's too powerful to really fully overthrow. So there's this constant tension that's going on. But what I wanted to do, thinking about Circe's myths, is I wanted to be careful to avoid kind of huge tour through Greek myth. I didn't want to bring in Pegasus. I didn't want to bring in Hercules. I didn't want to hit absolutely everybody because I feel like that feels very artificial and fake. I wanted to keep the interaction she has with mythology ones that are plausible or that make sense for her myth. So I started exploring her family, and her sister is Pasiphae, the mother of the Minotaur. So I know she's going to interact with the Minotaur story now. If you ever have the opportunity to write a Minotaur C-section scene in a novel as a novelist, you must do it. So that.
And for those who haven't read the book, when you hit that part, it'll be quite a shock.
My husband is always my first reader, and so I wrote that scene and gave it to him, and he read it and he looked up at me and he said, "You really went for it, didn't you?" So yes, I did. But her brother is Aeetes, who's the father of Medea. So she's also the aunt of not only the Minotaur, but Medea, the other great witch from ancient Greek literature. Plus, she is related to Prometheus, the god who brings fire and civilization to mankind. And there is no myth there very early on. So this isn't much of a spoiler because it's in chapter 2. Very early on, she meets Prometheus and she sees him as he's being punished for helping mankind. And there is no myth about her actually meeting him. And I thought long and hard about having them interact because I didn't want to be artificially kind of shoving them together. But in the mythology, Helios and Oceanus, Helios is her father, Oceanus is her grandfather, are a really significant part of the Prometheus myth as sort of the other powerful big titans. So it made sense to me that she had an in to this meeting. So I tried to do stuff like that. I looked at all the sources that are out there. As you say, there are not that many about Circe. And then I sort of allowed those sources to grow in my mind. Other things that I did were I took the story from Ovid that Ovid uses about a love triangle that she's in between her, Glaucus, a god who used to be immortal, and a nymph whose name I will not say because it is a spoiler, even though it is, a several thousand-year-old spoiler. But there's a love triangle between the three of them, and so I took that love triangle, but I kind of reordered it a little bit, and I gave Circe a little bit more psychological reasoning for doing what she does in Ovid. And what I was really interested in keeping that triangle is that Circe does something really horrible to this nymph out of a very misplaced sense of anger. It's really internalized misogyny. The person she's really angry at is Glaucus. But instead, she lashes out at this other nymph, and she does something horrible that cannot be undone. And then she has to live with that.
So we've gotten a couple questions in the comments, so I'll go ahead and read them to you. So the first one is, it's more a comment, but something that I think would be interesting for us to hear more about. And that's, in the Song of Achilles and Circe, there's this difference between the human and the divine, between Achilles and Circe, right? And at least for some of the story, Achilles strives for being much more than a human, and Circe falls in love with him with mundane humanity. Right? Achilles wants to be this god that everybody will remember forever, and Circe thinks that being human might be so much better than the immortality she's trapped in. But it's not really a question as our comment states, but just something that maybe we could hear a little bit more about.
Sure. Well, the one thing that I think has always struck me about the stories of mythology is that the gods are really mostly not role models.
Mm-hmm.
You don't want to act like them. And that when Achilles is acting at his most brutal and most, cruel and vengeful and rage-filled, he is said to be acting most like a god. That the gods are petty and selfish, and they will, if you offend them for even something very small, they will punish you and your children and your children's children, that there is no mercy among the gods, and there's only self-interest among the gods. And so I'm actually really interested in the fact that it turns out in sort of the world of psychology that psychologists have done studies that when human beings are given kind of total protection from any consequences, when we are, lifted way above our peers in terms of privilege or power, that actually what happens psychologically is that unless we fight against it, our empathy starts dropping. We become, in essence, a sort of Greek god. And that story is a story that doesn't just get told in the Greek mythology. It gets told in, for example, Shakespeare's King Lear. Mm-hmm. King Lear is the story of a man who has not been told no for 80 years. And the first time someone says no to him, he blows up his family and has an epic temper tantrum. And then he has to spend sort of the rest of the play learning how to be human again and how to reconnect his humanity, which he is able to do. But what was interesting to me about the gods is that most gods are stagnant. They are incapable of change. They can only be changed by sort of outside forces, by the fates forcing them to change, or another god forcing them to change. Mm-hmm. And so what would it be like to be interacting with this group of people who are basically, if we're going to get diagnostic about it, sociopathic narcissists?
It's pretty true, yeah. Another question that we've gotten in, you've given us Patroclus and Circe. Which other characters from the Iliad and Odyssey that Homer neglected are characters that we should learn more about?
Oh my goodness. I mean, for me, I think almost all of them. Basically, any character in Homer, I think, could be their own novel, if you had passion to write it. I mean, one of my personal challenges was not bringing in Hector and Andromache at every turn. They are two of my favorite characters from the Iliad. I see Hector as the true hero of the Iliad, actually. I think he's the most noble person in there. He's the one who's fighting most understandably for his family, mm-hmm. And for his family and people's survival. And so I think, so much to be said about them. But also there's just so much more. I mean, the character who's kind of always in the background of so much of this is Clytemnestra, Agamemnon's wife. She obviously stars in some other places other than the Iliad and the Odyssey. But I would also want to hear from the perspectives of many of the slave characters, who really get, again, kind of silenced. So my eye always takes me to who are the characters who are being silenced, who are the characters who, we're just getting these little glimpses into their story, but we're not getting their whole story.
And do you think that over the years, given the translations that we've had, that story has kind of been buried? I don't want to say on purpose, but as a result of our perspectives at the time when the translations were made, the story of the slaves in Odysseus's home, for example, which Emily Wilson actually does a great job of explaining that, hey, these are actually slaves and not maids in her, groundbreaking translation of the Odyssey. Is that something that you are actively trying to bring into the book, this insight into the gender and power relationships in ancient mythology? And I think they can be directly applicable to a modern audience as well.
Yes, absolutely. I totally agree. And by the way, if any of you are watching and you have not read Emily Wilson's translation, it is brilliant. And I totally agree that it is just, she does such a great job of sort of pulling back the layers of tradition in translating the Odyssey and kind of seeing it with new eyes. And one of the main things that she does, as you mentioned, is that there's a scene at the end of the Odyssey where Odysseus orders these 12 maids to be hanged maids. And he says, that it's because they slept with the suitors and therefore they betrayed his house. And so they have to be killed in order to kind of finish the purging of the house. But when we realize that these women are slaves, when we use that word, which is the original word in the ancient Greek, when we use that word in English translation, slave means something very different to us than maid. I mean, maid implies, they get a salary, maybe they go home at night, right? There isn't this sense of, these women had no consent to give. They had no ability to refuse these men. This was not a betrayal of Odysseus's house. They were in an impossible situation. So that whole event becomes much darker and more troubling. And I love that she brings that out, and I totally support that kind of stuff. She does something else in the chapter between the Cyclops chapter. She calls the pirate and the shepherd. And that's Odysseus the pirate and the Cyclops the shepherd. So I love that she's kind of bringing new little visions to these things to remind us, actually, Odysseus is the invader. That's the Cyclops' land.
Yeah, it's an interesting take, because when I was reading the book, I was waiting anxiously to see, what's the interaction going to be like with Odysseus, because our point of reference for Circe all these years has been through Odysseus's lens and in the Odyssey. And, we've grown up thinking, he's this cunning hero who's chosen by Athena, and he uses his mind to overcome all these obstacles on his, just quest to get home. And after reading the book, I kind of take a step back and say, wait a second, like, is Odysseus really, this hero that we've all talked about? Is there another layer to him that's kind of dark? What do you want readers to take away when they read Circe? Is it something similar, a reframing of the original stories, maybe?
Yeah, I hopefully to see some of the stories in a new light, but not, sometimes people have asked me after reading the book, why do you hate Odysseus so much? And I really don't hate Odysseus. I just think he would be quite hard to live with. But every story that I tell about Odysseus in the novel comes from ancient mythology. It just doesn't all come from the Odyssey. Some of it comes from the Iliad. Some of it comes from the tragedies. And one of the things, while we're on Odysseus, that I think is interesting is that, as you say, Odysseus has been such a beloved character. I think the BBC recently held a poll on the best story of all time, and the Odyssey won. And the Iliad was, I think, number 9. But the Odyssey was number 1, and everyone loved Odysseus. He's clever, he's smart, he's got a great wife, he's an underdog, right? He wants to go home. We can all identify with that. But what's interesting is that I think the Odyssey is really the most positive portrait of Odysseus from the ancient world, and it's still not that positive. Right. So, a lot of the other versions, particularly in tragedies, he's almost a villain. So it's interesting that there's this, he and Achilles, I think, make wonderful foils for each other, because Achilles is, the young man who's honest to a fault. There's so many times in the Iliad where you wish you could say to Achilles, buddy, if you could just take it down one notch, your life would be a lot easier. But he can't do that because he sort of feels and he speaks. And it's all sort of one thing, whereas Odysseus is the exact opposite. Achilles has a line in the Iliad where he says, I hate like the gates of death, the man who says one thing and hides another in his heart, which is, the definition of Odysseus.
Right.
So I love that there's this tension between valuing that sort of honesty and valuing the trickery.
Well, it's interesting, too, that Homer chooses to use one epic, the Iliad, to portray that concept of that, like that pure honor, straightforwardness. This is the way it is, and I'm going to say it how I feel, and I will act honorably in everything that I do, the way that Achilles behaves, more or less. And then he devotes an entire other book to the cunning, wily Odysseus, who, says one thing means another thing. I'm curious if there's anything in original texts that you've read that indicates that the ancient Greeks had these similar questions about their heroes.
I mean, absolutely. I think that you see this in, I mean, I think that it is hard, when I read the Iliad, I don't think that Achilles is being held up as a role model. I think that, part of what I love about these stories is how incredibly human they are, and how oftentimes when we say the word hero today, we mean someone who's like morally virtuous. But that when we use the word hero in the context of the ancient stories, it really means something else. And I love that in these myths, the characters are allowed to be proud and to make mistakes and to, bring destruction on their family through their own folly. And so part of what I wanted to do in writing Circe in particular was to let Circe make huge mistakes, the way the male heroes have always made huge mistakes, and to let her have to wrestle with those mistakes and the consequences of those mistakes. But part of what I love about Circe is that she doesn't let herself be stuck in those moments. She is a goddess of transformation. And so she is always working to do better and to think harder and think deeper and try again.
Right. And I think in the book, it's great to see her trajectory, because you start off with this incredible naivety in the beginning, and she grows, and each experience changes her. And then as she reaches a new stage, she realizes she can actually, be an agent of change in her own world, versus being this, the daughter of a titan who has to obey her parents. And it's really interesting to see how that transformation across time throughout all the chapters.
Oh, well, thank you. That's so kind.
I'm going to pull up another question that we've got. So one of our commenters has asked that they've read that HBO is going to be bringing Circe to this big screen. What can you tell us about that?
Sure. I can tell you that I'm really excited, but I don't have too many details, unfortunately. So it's actually going to be, it's a HBO Max, which is kind of a sister to HBO. I love the people that I gave the book to. I spent a lot of time talking with people who were interested in Circe, because I really wanted someone who understood that this was her story, and that this was really the story of her life and her growing up. And I loved that the producers that I was speaking to really were invested in that. And so there are writers attached and working on scripts. I haven't seen any of them yet, but I feel really, I have really strong faith in the people who have it. So I'm very excited to see what the result is. And sometimes people ask me, did you feel some qualms giving it away? No, because I don't know anything about transforming into TV.
Right.
Absolutely nothing. I feel like there's no way I could do that. And there needs to be some kind of huge transformation that has to happen.
Right.
So I think I leave it to the experts. Now, I do have a strong background in theater and the stage. So if any of my books ever ends up on the stage, I will be much more controlling about it.
Maybe you'll write the screenplay for that one.
I would love to.
Along the same line, we've got another question. Who would you cast as Circe in the show if you got to choose, and why?
Oh, that is such a good question. And I'm going to have a really unsatisfying answer, so I apologize, which is that I don't have anyone in particular. But please leave comments with suggestions, because I feel like I would love to have some ideas. But I think the reason that I don't have any one person in particular is twofold. One, as I mentioned, I have a theater background. I'm a theater director, actually. And so for me, it's all about the audition process. So I feel like I would need to be in the room seeing someone do it, because the tricky thing about the role of Circe is that you need the same actress to play her through her, over the course of centuries, and kind of grow up in terms of her mannerisms and in terms of her behavior, but not in terms of her face. So, you have to be able to age her up and age her down totally based on the way you speak and the way you move and the way you act. So I think it's a really fun challenge for an actress. that, you remain the same, but all your mannerisms and affect have to age.
Right. We've got another question in, and it's a little bit along the same vein, but looking ahead at what's next for Madeline Miller. And our question is, in one of your talks, you mentioned the possibility of writing a book on Dido of Carthage. Can you provide any further details on your plan for that?
Sure. So, I have always been, I'm in love with the Aeneid as well. The Aeneid, the original fan fiction. Let's do it again, but from the Trojan perspective. And I think that I also feel like the story of the Trojan refugees is such a powerful story at this moment. In particular, a powerful story always. There are always refugees in our world, and this is something that has been a struggle for all of human history, basically. But Dido is one of my favorite characters, and she's kind of there's a little bit of the Circe in her. But I love how she's such a powerful queen in her own right. So all I will say is something Aeneid based. But actually, before I get to the Aeneid, I have something else that I'm working on, which is taking me a little bit outside of the Greek world, although not totally, which is I'm working on The Tempest next.
By Shakespeare.
So, yeah, Shakespeare's Tempest. Okay. So, which is really his most, in some ways, obviously it's not Julius Caesar and Antony Cleopatra, but it's a very classically influenced play. There's a lot of Ovid in it. There's a lot of Virgil in it. There's a lot of sort of ideas from the ancient world. And of course, it's also about magic and witches and islands. So I think that
right up your
the
alley
Tempest might be next, and then the Aeneid and Dido are after that.
Perfect. This question's from Nikos Katsibras. Do you feel that you got more out of writing the Song of Achilles or more out of writing Circe?
Oh, both. I absolutely loved writing them both. And I feel like I learned so much over the course of they were really, it was a decade of my life for both of them. Song of Achilles was 10 years to write and Circe was 7. So I spent a lot of time in that world, not to mention all the time I had already spent kind of building the foundation for that. That time period, 10 and 7, is just the writing time. It's not all the years I spent obsessing over the Greek epics and learning ancient Greek and reading commentaries on the Iliad and the Odyssey. But I feel like I grew so much from spending time in both those worlds. So I would say it's equal but different.
Okay. Did you have any ground rules for yourself about remaining true to Greek mythology? Any liberty you gave yourself versus lines you wouldn't cross?
I love to write very close to the mythology because I really like to be sort of in conversation with Homer. And I don't think you have to do that in order to be successful. But that's how I like to do it. A recent example of a novel that I think took the Odyssey, at a much more distant sense is Tayari Jones's An American Marriage. It was inspired by the Odyssey, but the mechanism for separating husband and wife, the Odysseus and Penelope characters, instead of it being war, it's wrongful incarceration. So, that's an example. That novel was incredibly successful. I think it's incredibly moving. It's really of the moment, but also it's going back and drawing on these things. But I like to write much, much closer than that. So let's see, what were my ground rules? One of my rules was that I was going, this is a kind of a more at the shallow end of my rules, but one of them was that if the name had a known English version of the name, for example, Circe, then I would use the most commonly known English version of the name. So that's why it's Circe as opposed to, Kirke.
Right.
And if the name was not known at all, then I went with the ancient Greek, which is why I used Aiaia as opposed to Aeaea, which is kind of the Latinized version. I liked using, so I go with if it's unknown, I go with the ancient Greek. Otherwise, I go with whatever's the most well-known modern version. I knew that I wanted to kind of write very close to the Odyssey episode, but I also knew that there were certain things that I wanted to transform, but I felt like I could justify those transformations. So the Circe episode in the Odyssey is actually narrated by Odysseus himself. Most of the Odyssey is told by the poet.
Right.
But the Circe episode is Odysseus telling the story to the Phaeacians that he's trying to impress. And once I realized that, I thought, this is Odysseus the liar who tells every story to suit himself. So all of a sudden, this story of, the beautiful goddess who I tamed, and then she threw herself at me, and she was very hot, which he says again and again in the Circe episode, is really all about making himself look good. And so as soon as I sort of realized that, I felt like Homer was almost giving me permission to say, okay, that's Odysseus's version.
Right.
Now, what would it look like from someone else's perspective? So I wanted to kind of keep it connected to that, but I wanted to take out what I felt was Odysseus's self-aggrandizing. So she does not kneel in my version, but they do have, many of the same kind of plot points that happen. She turns his men into pigs. And she have to come to an understanding. They become lovers. He stays on the island for a year. All those things I kept that basic structure, but I allowed it to be from her perspective as opposed to from his.
Okay. Given that it's a story of perspectives and we get to see the story from Circe's side in the book, we also, in a portion of the book, there's a look at Penelope, for example. And you kind of see a different side to Penelope than what we are used to in the Odyssey of, the wife who's just simply waiting for Odysseus to come back faithfully. And when he comes back, everything is perfect. What are your feelings about other female characters in the classics, such as Persephone, Helen, Cassandra, for example?
I mean, I think they could all, be multiple novels, that there's so many. I mean, that's what I love about this material is I feel like it is endlessly rich. These stories are so deep and profound that you can keep turning the kaleidoscope and seeing a new thing as you turn it. So I know that Persephone is a great, has so many people have written poems about Persephone and the Persephone, Demeter, Hades triangle. Is this a story of a mother's devoted love to her child who is taken from her? Is this a story of a mother's smothering and suffocating love and a daughter who wants to get away? Is this a story about, rebirth and cycles of human life? I mean, I feel like there are literally thousands of different nuanced interpretations you could take on all these. And I would love to see people come in and do that and kind of illuminate those things. I mean, Cassandra, it's hard to think of a story that is more relevant. This idea of the woman who is attacked, in some versions raped, in other versions, assaulted, and who then tries to tell the truth and no one will listen to her. I mean, I feel like that is, we're still talking about that.
Yeah. I think you've mentioned it before where it's Apollo is the one who engages in the act and then he curses her that no one will believe her no matter how many times she tells the truth.
Yes. Yes.
You briefly mentioned some works that are based on Homer outside of your own work, obviously. How do you feel about certain works like Percy Jackson, for example?
I mean, as a former Latin teacher, my Latin teacher and Greek teacher agenda is always, I love that people are bringing that Percy Jackson is bringing so many new people into these stories. I cannot tell you the number of Latin and Greek students who came to my class and said, I'm here because of Percy Jackson. So, I love it. I think reinterpretations and retellings are always a way to bring people back to the original. When people say, I read your book and it allowed me to go back and read the Iliad and the Odyssey, I think, yes. So I think it's great. I think it's wonderful. And in the beginning, so I talked about how originally I felt like it was blasphemy for me to be writing about these things. And
I think a lot of people that study classics, they begin with the idea of this purist point of view, and
yes.
Either it changes or it doesn't. But
yes, but as sort of my view that has kind of evolved is that all these stories, there is no such thing as the definitive version of any of them. That there's Homer's version, and then there is all these later, there's Aeschylus's version, and then there's, Plato's version of the story, and then there is Ovid's version and Virgil's version and Shakespeare's version, and it just keeps evolving. I mean, there's so many different, Achilles really taught me this. There are so many different versions of this story, of his story, of what happens to him. They all contradict each other because they're not meant to be one, continuous canon, because they're being made by all these different brains and all these different hands. And so what I came to feel is that, I'm not going to hurt Homer. He's fine. And that by retelling these stories, what we are really doing is just keeping the myth tradition alive. And it's not like it's something that is breaking with tradition. This has been a continuous tradition of retelling since the very first person told these stories.
Yeah. So a couple of questions that I'm going to combine here. There's a comment, they loved reading Circe, and Greek mythology aside, the way that you made her relatable to women and mothers was really incredible. And, never thought that they could read a story about a sorceress and feel connected to her. And I'm going to bring in a second question here. There's a meeting, in fact, between two mothers in the book, and it's Circe and Penelope. What was most exciting to you about writing about that first meeting between these two women and exploring them in contrast to the Odysseus they knew?
Knowing that Penelope was waiting for me in the last quarter of the novel was one of my favorite things about writing the novel, is that knowing that this friendship between the two women was going to, and this meeting was going to take place between these two women. And I loved that they were both incredibly smart, incredibly complicated. They're survivors. They were both single mothers. And they're both artists. They're both artists in their own way. Penelope is the greater artist at the loom, but Circe is an artist in her witchcraft. And so they understand this life of creation as well. And I really wanted Circe to mirror, in some ways, the Odyssey, in the sense that it's a longing for homecoming. Just as Odysseus longs for his nostos, his homecoming, Circe also longs for homecoming, except her homecoming is not at her home where her dysfunctional, abusive family is.
Not a physical place.
Yes, she has to create it herself. And Penelope was a huge part of that. Of finding that homecoming, that she finally finds, this incredibly close, powerful, interesting woman that she can really connect with. So you mentioned before, sort of seeing different sides to Penelope. One of the things that I feel like people often talk about, that story of her weaving, her very cleverly, saying, oh, I'll choose one of the suitors to marry as soon as I'm done, weaving this shroud for my father-in-law. And then every night she unravels it, and then she does it during the day. And the men don't catch on for years because they have no idea how long it takes to to weave a shroud. Yeah. She finally has to get ratted out by one of her maids. But what is interesting about that, one of her slaves, going back to our earlier part of the conversation, but one of the things that I find so interesting about that is that she is a true artist at the loom, and I wanted that to be a really core part of her, this creative impulse, and her ability to also transform the world with art, just as Circe does. But I also wanted to highlight, in the case of both Circe and Penelope, that, yes, when we talk about heroism, we're traditionally talking about going off and seeing monsters and fighting battles, but that there is something intensely heroic about what Penelope does, which is stay at home for 20 years, raise her child, and hold things together. Under intense pressure from a situation where she's not given a lot of authority. I mean, that takes incredible self-discipline. It takes incredible force of will. And I wanted all that to come out with Penelope.
And I think there are some works that have extrapolated on that, like the Penelope ad, for example.
Yes.
Speaking of some of those other works, we have another question. What do you think about the lost books of the Odyssey? They realized that, they loved it because it was a way to spend more time with these beloved stories, without just, reverting to the original texts.
Yes, I thoroughly enjoyed the Lost Books of the Odyssey. And what's interesting is actually, I love, we were talking before about sort of adaptation and how you can be successful writing very close to the material and quite far away. In the original I'm not sure if it made the second edition, but in the original edition of Lost Books of the Odyssey, there's one where Penelope is a werewolf. And it's a very kind of fun and interesting story that, is connecting to the myth in an interesting way. But, I think he's a great example of someone who is taking some big leaps from the original material and really transforming it in interesting ways, but also kind of pointing us back. So I think it's a very fun and interesting riff. I think they're riffs on the Odyssey.
Mm-hmm. So popularity of books like Song of Achilles, like Circe, I think Stephen Pressfield's Gates of Fire as well, and Emily Wilson's new translation of the Odyssey, which has gotten a lot of media attention. I think it shows that the classics are as relevant as ever in today's world. What do you make about this renewed interest in the classics, or is it even a renewed interest? Has it always been there? And how do you look to the classics to find meaning in today's world?
For me, the classics and the modern world have always been completely connected. Mm-hmm. That from my earliest readings, I just felt, I don't know if it's just how my brain works or how they were presented to me, but it felt as if, this is not something old. These are living stories of humans. And the Odyssey is such a great example of that. Here we have this story that is about a war veteran who is exhausted and is trying to get home to his family. And then he gets home, and it's actually much harder to re-enter his old life than he thought it was going to be. And there's much more stress and much more anxiety, and much more, kind of fighting that has to go on. And so that is a story that is, I think, a timeless human story. But also, even if you kind of take it a level out from that, it's the story of someone searching for home, which is, talk about a universal human story. So I see that, yes, culture has changed, and there certainly technology has changed between then and now. So there are some differences, but that we humans have not changed. And so I look back at these old texts, and I am always just struck anew every time I read them by how incredibly fresh they are, and how even the things when you read them where they feel like, okay, that's very sexist. Mm-hmm. I feel like you can still kind of open it up and say, well, how would it be from the other person's perspective? So even those moments that feel in some ways dated, I think in my mind, they're just opportunities to allow those characters to tell their own story.
So we'll wrap up with a last question, and if I see any new ones in the comments, I'll bring it up. But you mentioned, the new works that are going to be coming out are going to be based on Shakespeare's Tempest and possibly something on the Aeneid and Dido. But in the immediate short term, we're looking forward to the release of the paperback version of Circe. Can you tell us a little bit about what's in store for you, what kind of travel engagement you're going to be having, and maybe where people can check that out so they can see where they can follow your events and maybe get an in-person book club rather than just a virtual one?
Yes. Well, it comes out April 14th. So my book tour, I had an amazing book tour at lots and lots of wonderful places. Unfortunately, that has all been canceled. But, rightly so. I think it's important to keep everybody safe. But a lot of those independent bookstores, I would put in a plug for independent bookstores, because a lot of them are really hurting right now with the loss of all these author events that keep them going. And a lot of them are still mailing books. And in fact, one of my local independent bookstores is called Main Point Books. And if you want to order a signed copy of any of my books, either Song of Achilles, Circe the hardcover, Circe the paperback, when it comes out, if you just get in touch with them, I will sign it and send it to you. It will all be very germ-free and safe, and you'll be supporting an independent bookstore. So still support your independent bookstores, because a lot of them are close to customers but open to mailing or even delivery. I've heard of a bunch of bookstores that are doing leave it on your porch, leave it on your doorstep, socially distant delivery. So I hope that a lot of that is just postponed and will be rescheduled. And so if people want to find out what I'm going to be doing, follow me on Twitter or on Instagram, Twitter is often where I post my announcements, and I'll be posting an updated schedule on my website as well. We're still kind of working out the details, but basically I'm going to move some of my tour virtual. And so I'm going to be doing a bunch of events online. So if I didn't answer your questions today, or you have more questions, or you just want to check in, and I may do some readings, that kind of stuff, check in with me and on Twitter, and I will keep it posted when I do virtual events.
And we'll be sure to share it too on Twitter and on our Facebook page so that everybody can keep up and know what's going on. And we'll post in our event page on Facebook links for both books, Song of Achilles and Circe.
Thank you.
On that note, Madeline, thank you very much for joining our very first virtual book club. It's been
Thanks
great
so much for
you.
having me. Thank you everyone for coming. Stay safe. Stay inside.
We'll be coming at you with more events like this. You can check our public schedule on our Facebook page for everything that's going to be going on this week. And we're looking forward to virtually seeing you guys again. Thanks again, Madeline.
Thank you.